3 at 5 o'clock Eastern. Next, Ohio Senator Rob Portman speaking during a fundraising trip in New Hampshire.
It's great to be here in New Hampshire, a classic swing state where, as Chairman McDonald just said, there is a dead heat now between the two candidates. Reminds me a little of Ohio, where I was a few days ago. And to Chairman McDonald, did you say that New Hampshire gave the Republican Party a suggestion during your primary? It was a strong suggestion. And congratulations to you and to Mitt Romney. I think Mitt Romney's going to run very well here in the general election, in part because folks know who he is. You know, being in the greater Boston media market and understanding that he's a governor who inherited a $3 billion deficit, turned it around to a $2 billion rainy day fund, essentially a surplus. Working with a Democrat legislature, 85% Democrat, was able to cut taxes 19 times, and frankly was able to show leadership as an executive and get things done, which is what we desperately need in Washington, D.C. right now. So my sense is, with your leadership, Wayne, he's going to do very well in New Hampshire, as he did in the primary. And I'm delighted to be here to help out a little bit tonight. Some of you, I know, have been asking, whether I've been to Wolfboro. The answer is no. However, I have been on 4 college campuses in the last 40 hours. And I'm here with my daughter, who's 17 years old, and she's a junior in high school, and she's doing the college tour with her dad. And the most recent one we went to was Dartmouth, where we are today, where I just left her in the hands of some of my son's older friends, so I hope that works out well. But it's been really fun to spend some time with her, and also to help a little bit on the political front. The New Hampshire Republican Party has been terrific in reaching out to me and asking me to come up to help them, and I'm delighted to do that tonight. We're having a fundraiser after this event and have the opportunity to see a lot of old friends who I've known, some from my days at Dartmouth, others from politics over the years. I was up here, in the primary for the Republican candidates, including George H.W. Bush, including Bob Dole, including George W. Bush. I've been involved now in 6 presidential campaigns, now the 7th, and often end up in New Hampshire because it's such a critical state in the primary for Republicans, of course, but also during the general election. It's great to see Steve's results as an entrepreneur. I knew he was a great friend of John McCain's and was selfless on the campaign trail, doing a little of everything. But we used to talk about what he was up to back home, and it's neat to see this place and the other ways in which he has created jobs here in Concord and now engaging again in a presidential campaign, because, as you said, if you're an entrepreneur and you're a risk taker, you need a new business environment, and part of that is going to be dictated by Washington. And right now, with the taxes and regulations, higher health care costs, the uncertainty over energy, all the unpredictability in our economy, it's very difficult to get people to take a risk and to make an investment and to do what Steve has done and what, my family has done back in Ohio. I come out of that background. My dad was a small business guy who took a big risk, left his job as a salesman to start his own business, and in his later years, I asked him a couple years ago whether he would do it again, and he had to say, I don't know, because there's just so much uncertainty out there, and frankly, you have a government in Washington that doesn't seem to get it and is making it more difficult, not easier, to create jobs. So Steve's a great example of someone who has taken some risks over time and is concerned now, as all of us are, with what we're seeing in this economy. On Monday, I will be helping the Romney victory effort in Boston. I'll be speaking at a couple of events there, helping to raise money for the campaign and also, doing whatever I can to help the victory effort, which is separate from the campaign, but engaged with them. Back home in Ohio, I am the chairman of the campaign. I've been very engaged in the campaign, both in the primary and now in the general election. My whole team's engaged. We have volunteers in every one of Ohio's 88 counties who are plugged in already. We're working very hard. Ohio is, like New Hampshire, a classic swing state. We happen to have a few more electoral votes, but we have a very similar situation where the polling is moving back and forth. It looks to us like it's a dead heat. And there's a relatively small group of voters who are undecided. The pollsters tell us it may be 15% of the voters. Some say 10% even. But they're looking carefully at both candidates, and they're looking carefully at what's happening in the economy. What they're seeing right now, unfortunately, is a continued weak economy, and real concern being expressed across our state and here in New Hampshire and across the country with what's happening. The reason I'm so engaged in this campaign is I am truly concerned about what's happening with the economy and what direction that we're headed. These job numbers that came out yesterday are further evidence, unfortunately, of an economy that is not performing to the point that, it is putting a lot of middle-class jobs at risk. It's not giving us the opportunity to be able to see the kind of growth we need to get us back to the kind of growth we've seen since the 1980s in this country. These job numbers are not just bad, they're part of a trend. And if you look at the last 3 months combined is the worst job numbers we've had in 2 years. A few days ago, we actually got the report on manufacturing indicating we have the first downturn in manufacturing in 3 years. So this has led some economists to say that we may be looking at a double-dip recession. And this is even before we look at what's happening at year-end, where economists, including the Congressional Budget Office, Economic Analysis, and the Federal Reserve Analysis indicates that unless we resolve this so-called deficit cliff coming up at year-end, the fiscal cliff, that we may indeed see the economy go back into a recession, even if we're growing at 2 or 3%. So these are very troubling times. These are times that require leadership. We have not seen that from President Obama. In fact, instead what we've seen is him putting in place policies and making promises that he hasn't been able to keep because the policies are not working. So President Obama pushed through the Congress on a total partisan basis a stimulus package, spending almost $1 trillion, saying that unemployment today would be under 6%. Instead, we have over 8%. And in fact, we've had over 8% unemployment now in this country for 41 consecutive weeks, which is the kind of job performance that, 41 straight months, which is the kind of job performance that has led a lot of people to look at an alternative. And when I mentioned earlier that there's a relatively small number of voters that haven't made their mind up, those voters are looking for a better way. They understand that with these high unemployment numbers, with the manufacturing numbers going down, with consumer confidence taking a dip, that the policies that President Obama and the Democrat Congress have put in place simply aren't working, and we need a better way. The good news is we have a candidate running who did very well in the New Hampshire primary and is now spending a lot of time in Ohio and other swing states, a candidate who has a very clear idea of where this country ought to go in terms of the economy. He has the record, he has the experience, and he has the policies to turn things around. And this is precisely what we need right now. I talked about his record in Massachusetts, where he was a successful governor working with the Democrat legislature. That kind of leadership is lacking in Washington today. He's also someone who in the private sector, like Steve, was an entrepreneur, a risk taker, created over 100,000 net jobs in his business career. He's also someone who took the Olympics at a time when they were mired in scandal and debt and turned it around at a time when the economy needed a shot in the arm after 9/11. And he's someone who has put together a plan for the economy that on day one will help to get this country back on track. So when you look at President Obama's unmet promises, that we'd be at less than 6% unemployment today, that the deficit would be cut in half, that we'd see a lower health care cost per family, none of these have been met. They simply indicate that his policies aren't working. And then you have Governor Romney, who has promised that on day one that he will move forward on an aggressive economic plan, including reform of the tax code to give the economy a needed shot in the arm, including an aggressive national energy policy using domestic sources of energy, approving the Keystone Pipeline, among other things, on day one. And he will initiate on day one a review of every regulation to begin to get some of this burden off small business owners here in New Hampshire, in Ohio, and around the country. That he'll begin the process of repealing both the Dodd-Frank legislation, which has created tremendous problems in terms of credit, in terms of small businesses getting the loans that they need, and also the President's health care plan, which has been a big topic of conversation in the last week with the Supreme Court ruling, and that he'll begin the process of getting our economy back to where it should be, which is a growing economy where our kids and our grandkids, future generations, are going to be able to see what we've seen, which is our parents and grandparents being able to pass along to the next generation a more prosperous America and more opportunity and growth. So we have a very clear choice in the selection. We have one candidate who's put in place policies that he thought were right and made promises as to what the results would be. They haven't worked. And we have another candidate who has the record, the experience, and the policies to be able to turn things around and is ready day one to go to work to create that opportunity that we've all here in New Hampshire, in Ohio, and around the country been looking for, which is restoring the American dream. With that, questions, comments, thoughts are welcome.
Please identify by name and organization with your questions.
Senator Steve Peoples of the Associated Press.
Hey, Steve.
Are you being vetted right now by the Romney campaign, and do you plan to meet with Mitt Romney or senior staff privately before you leave New England?
On those questions on the vetting, I've said from the very start that's really up to the campaign. I'm not going to address them. And as I said, I'm here mostly on a college tour with my daughter, but at the same time, helping out a little bit with the New Hampshire Republican Party and also with the Romney campaign in Boston on Monday.
Do you have plans to meet privately with the governor before you leave New England?
I'm just not going to get into it, but no, I have no plans.
Senator Portman, Carolyn Cho, WBAN. Would you care to comment, please, about the current situation with Syria and foreign policy in general?
Well, I think where President Obama has not led is really in three areas. One is the debt and deficit. We talked some about that, and rejecting his own fiscal commission's recommendations, I think showed a lack of leadership, hasn't reached out to Congress on a bipartisan basis. Second, in terms of the economy, the policies he's put in place haven't worked, and he hasn't been willing to promote the kind of strong pro-growth agenda we need. In fact, instead, he's put in place policies that are making it more difficult to create jobs and use the kind of anti-jobs, class warfare rhetoric that makes it harder to get the economy back on track. But the third area is foreign policy. And whether it's Iran or North Korea or what's happening in Syria today, America has not shown the leadership that we should. So, the Syrian situation is complicated. I was over in the Mideast a few weeks ago, had the opportunity to meet with leaders both in the Arab world and in Israel, and also was in Afghanistan with our troops. And we had a lot of discussions about what's going on in Syria today and what should be done. My own view is that America ought to take a more aggressive stance and ought to be assisting some of the forces that are trying to defend themselves against Assad. And you've probably seen some of the press reports and seen some of the TV coverage of the terrible atrocities that have been committed, and it's truly a tragedy, a humanitarian tragedy. I think the United States can and should play a more aggressive role, working with our Arab partners, including Gulf states, but also Turkey. Turkey's, as you know, very interested in working more closely with the United States to ensure that the opposition to Assad have the ability to defend themselves. I think the United States should play a bigger role there.
So army then?
I think it's appropriate.
Senator Phil Rucker from the Washington
Phil, good to see you.
Good to see you too. I'm wondering, President Obama and Vice President Biden are both out on the campaign trail pretty aggressively, ramping up a lot of their attacks on Governor Romney. And do you think it would be advantageous to the governor to select a running mate earlier rather than later, rather than waiting until the convention?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think maybe Chairman McDonald is a political leader to have a comment on this, but it's interesting because there are plenty of surrogates out there for Mitt Romney as well, and some of those are on the so-called list. Others may not be, but I don't think he's had any shortage of interest among Republicans in getting out and talking on his behalf in Ohio, here in New Hampshire. I know you've had some other folks here, Republican leaders, and around the country. And it's because we all share this deep concern about the direction of the country. So I think there are, Phil, plenty of surrogates out there. In fact, it seems to me, again, I've been involved in my 7th presidential campaign, there are more surrogates this year on the Republican side than I've seen in the past. And the party really came together after the primary. If you look at some of the polling, the battleground polling from Lake and Goez, which is a bipartisan, once every 6 weeks poll, I think it is, the party loyalty around Mitt Romney was extraordinary, even a few weeks after he became the presumptive nominee. So our party's really come back together strongly, and I think every Republican leader I know is strongly supporting him and wanting to get out there and talk about why and talk about the concerns they have with the direction the Obama administration is taking the country.
So when do you think would be the best time to make an interview?
You know, I don't know. I guess there have been different strategies. Sometimes with Dan Quayle, I think it was the day before the convention started, and then with others, it's been, I think with Sarah Palin, it was a couple weeks before. I'm not sure it matters a great deal. I think what matters is that we have an energy and enthusiasm on the Republican side, and I see that this year. I certainly see it in Ohio, where we've got people stepping up wanting to volunteer who were not engaged, frankly, in the 2008 campaign, and are willing this year to put the time and effort into being sure that, you know, there is a change for themselves and their families.
Senator Portman?
Yeah.
In many, Bob Costa with National Review.
Hey, Bob, good to see you.
Good to see you. In many previous cycles, you've played the role of debate prep, help candidates out. Has the Romney campaign asked you to play a similar role this year, preparing Mitt Romney or the VP for debates?
Yeah, I'd again refer you to the campaign on that.
Or are you interested in playing that role again, perhaps?
Well, look, I want to help every way I can. My understanding is they're not in that process yet. The debates are still a ways away, and there's only 3 of them. Unlike the primary, where there were, what, 19? Probably 19 in New Hampshire.
19 in New Hampshire.
So I think they're putting off that decision for a while. I do have a big job, which is representing my state in the United States Senate, which I love doing, and I'm spending a lot of time on that. You and I have talked about this, but we have a really aggressive legislative agenda. I think we passed 3 laws last week, or 3 bills that the President is willing to sign that will become law, and we continue to push hard on a number of legislative initiatives, including actually a bipartisan proposal on energy efficiency, and with Jeanne Shaheen, who's a Democrat senator here. And so I'm going to continue to focus on that, and then second, as chair of the campaign in Ohio, where we've you know, got a big task ahead of us. You know, if you saw the numbers today, it looks like the Obama campaign has put more money into Ohio than any other state in terms of their media buys. They've also put together an extensive ground operation, as have a lot of their allied groups. And you know, Ohio is definitely in the crosshairs in this election. And you know, both candidates and both parties are going to spend a lot of time and effort there. So we've got a little catching up to do in Ohio, because we had a primary and they didn't, and because they had a lot of resources early on and we didn't. We're starting to develop you know, more of a grassroots infrastructure in Ohio, and obviously, if you've seen on the fundraising totals the last 2 months, the Romney campaign is not only catching up, they're actually doing better than the Obama campaign. But prior to that time, the opposite was true. And so frankly, Bob, we've got our work cut out for us in Ohio, and I've got a big focus there.
Senator?
Yes.
Kaplan with CBS News and National Journal.
Rebecca.
Hi, Peter. Since the Supreme Court ruling on the Affordable Care Act a couple weeks ago, this big debate has emerged over whether the mandate is a penalty or a tax. And I'm wondering where you fall in that debate.
Well, it's not up to me. It's up to the Supreme Court, and they've said it's a tax. And as I have said from the outset, long before the Supreme Court even took up the case, and certainly while they were considering it, you know, whether it's constitutional or not, whether it's a tax or not, you know, whether the Commerce Clause was appropriate as a way to pass the legislation, it's still unaffordable. It's unaffordable to American families because our health care costs keep going up. It's unaffordable to businesses. As I mentioned earlier, many businesses in Ohio, and I'm sure the same is true in New Hampshire, Steve and Wayne can affirm this, are saying, look, this is a huge impediment to growth. Chamber of Commerce did a survey of small businesses and asked whether it was an impediment to growth. 75% of the folks responded yes. And then finally, it's unaffordable to the budget. If we don't get health care costs under control, it will bankrupt the country. And despite these claims that it's deficit neutral, the Congressional Budget Office has now come out with new reports indicating it is not. And by the way, it would only have been if you took $500 billion out of Medicare and put it into this new entitlement rather than saving Medicare, and if you added another $500 billion of new taxes, even not including the penalty taxes. So this health care law does not work. It doesn't work for our families. It doesn't work for job creation. It doesn't work for our budget. And to me, that's the central issue. not that you asked this question, but I'll go ahead and answer it anyway. This notion that somehow President Obama and Governor Romney have similar positions on health care is ridiculous. I mean, they couldn't be further apart. There will be an absolute contrast here for voters in New Hampshire, Ohio, and around the country to look at. You have one candidate strongly defending the health care law that he said would reduce costs to American families by a couple $1,000 a year. Instead, the opposite has happened, and who is going to defend 21 new tax increases that are in there, all the mandates, and defend, again, something that is not affordable to our family businesses or to our country. And then you have, with regard to Mitt Romney, someone who says that on day one, he's going to start taking the steps to dismantle this legislation, including providing a waiver to all 50 states, and believes there is a better way through patient-centered care and getting at the costs of health care through more competition, more transparency, and being able to, help American families afford health care. So huge differences here. And I do think that this will be an issue in the campaign. It relates directly to jobs, by the way, which I think is the central issue here. But until you get the health care costs under control, it's difficult to see the economy taking off.
So why do you think the mandate worked in Massachusetts under Governor Romney's plan?
Well, I know Governor Romney has talked a lot about this. I'll let his word stand in terms of Massachusetts, but he's made the good point that, we are 50 states, which are laboratories of democracy, and it's very different doing something at the federal level versus something at the state level. Every state's different. He's also focused on the fact that it related to about 8%, as I understand, of Massachusetts citizens who are uninsured, as opposed to this legislation, which affects all of us. And so they're not only very different laws, but one is state level and one is at the federal level. So I think the health care debate is going to be an important distinction between these two candidates. And independent voters, those who haven't made their mind up yet, in New Hampshire and Ohio, ought to look very carefully at the impact of this law if we do not change direction and replace it with something that works better. And I hope that will be one of the considerations as people decide who they're going to support.
Senator. One last question, please.
Senator Mark Halpern, Time Magazine.
You're Mark Halpern.
Since this is sponsored by a political group, I'm sure you'll be happy to answer another political question.
Yes, sir.
A lot of conservatives who you respect, like Rupert Murdoch and Jack Welch and Bill Kristol and the Wall Street Journal editorial page, have been critical of Governor Romney's campaign of late. Said they're not being aggressive enough in fighting back against ads in your states and others on paying capital and on outsourcing. How do you respond to those criticisms, and do you have any expectations or worry that the campaign could be being decided now?
Well, Mark, we talked earlier about the number of campaigns I've been involved with, and you've watched a lot of them over the years, and I think you would agree with me, there has never been a campaign where there hasn't been sniping from the outside and second guessing. And that's particularly true where there has been a Republican primary and there's been, some back and forth, or a Democratic primary on their side. I hear the same thing sometimes, by the way, on the Democratic side in terms of President Obama's campaign. So that's to be expected. In terms of responding, I think Mitt Romney's been very aggressive at laying out the alternatives. We just talked about health care. I don't think there's any question in voters' minds when they listen to both candidates as to where they stand. In terms of the economy, gosh, I think, we've got a huge difference of opinion. Recall when President Obama said he thought the private sector was doing fine, and this was, only a few weeks ago, and said the problem is we're not hiring enough government workers at the state and local level. It's just a totally different philosophy. And, Governor Romney was able to come back and say, look, the private sector is not doing fine. They certainly don't feel it. And the answer is not more government. The answer is, in fact, to get the private sector moving again along the lines of what Steve talked about earlier, by providing the tax relief, the regulatory relief, a national energy policy that we use our domestic sources, being sure that we're providing some predictability and certainty on the debt and deficit. So we got huge differences here. And I think, Mitt Romney's been very aggressive at laying out those differences. He'll have to continue to, because this will be a hard-fought campaign. There'll be a lot of back and forth, and people need to, look carefully at the facts as they're, hearing all these debates back and forth. In terms of bank capital, Mitt Romney's got a proud record. He's a guy who actually was in the business of creating jobs, not just talking about it. And he understands what it means to have a government in Washington that can create the environment for job growth versus one that creates a disincentive for entrepreneurs like Steve and others to be able to take a risk. That's a fundamental problem in our economy today. He understands that we've got some structural problems, like our antiquated and inefficient tax code, like the overregulation, like the fact that we're not producing more energy within America on where the government's involved, but less. Last year we produced 14% less oil on government lands, federal government lands, at a time when gas prices were at record highs. So he gets it that there's a different approach here. And I think he's going to be very aggressive in talking about those clear distinctions.
And on the specific point of advertising, again, in your state and others, going after his record on bank capital, do you think he needs to be more aggressive in fighting back on those specific allegations that some conservatives and Republicans have argued?
Mark, I think you need to respond to all of these allegations. And again, he's got, a record to be proud of, and he's got the ability to talk about this. I frankly wonder why the Obama campaign wants to talk so much about his private sector experience, because I think that's a huge advantage. I think a lot of those voters we talked about who are undecided at this point want somebody in the White House who actually knows what it takes to create a job and knows what's needed in Washington to help create the environment for job growth. I don't think that's a negative. I think that's a positive. And as we've seen with President Obama, he's surrounded himself with folks that don't have that experience, don't have that background. He doesn't have it. And it's resulted in, frankly, overregulation, overtaxing, the kind of health care policy that hurts jobs rather than helps jobs because it makes it more difficult, increases the cost of doing business. On energy, has not realized the potential of domestic energy to help create jobs and economic opportunity in this country. On trade, the first president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt not to ask for the ability to open up new markets for U.S. products, and yet hasn't been as tough on China as Governor Romney would like to be if he's elected president. So I think people are looking for somebody that actually understands what this problem is, and it's very evident from those disappointing job numbers yesterday, from the manufacturing numbers 3 or 4 days ago, from the consumer confidence numbers we've just seen, that our economy is not recovering. We have the weakest economic recovery since the Great Depression, and we're not heading in the right direction. We're heading in the wrong direction. So it's time for somebody who gets it, who understands how to turn this around. So, I know a lot of smart people in the Obama campaign. I'm sure they've thought through this. But for them to keep talking about the fact that he has private sector experience, I think that's what people are looking for, is someone who actually knows how to get this economy turned around.
So should he put Steve Dupree on the ticket?
He'd be a great choice. Kelly Ayotte would be a great choice, too, by the way, who happens to be from New Hampshire. Would be here.
Really?
Yeah. You heard her? And one of my colleagues in the Senate, who's one of my good friends there, and she's done a terrific job. But look, I think this election is going to turn on a number of issues, maybe some we haven't even talked about yet, because things tend to happen during campaigns that are unpredictable. I think when John McCain got the nomination, it was about Iraq, and in September of 2008 occurred, and so things may change. But there is a fundamental problem in our economy. We are not creating the economic opportunities that America has traditionally been able to pass along generation to generation. It's deep and it's serious. And if we don't fix this, we are not going to be able to continue to lead the world. As a beacon of hope and opportunity for the rest of the world, we've got to have a fundamentally strong economy in order to project force to the question about Syria and the discussion we had, the mention of North Korea and what's going on today in Iran. We've got to have a strong economy. I'm on the Armed Services Committee. I'm very concerned about what we're seeing in the debt and deficit in the economy because it affects our ability to lead the world, to be the country that promotes human rights, to be the country that promotes democracy and fight corruption and promote transparency and economic growth in other countries. And in order for us to be able to continue to have a strong middle class and to be able to provide opportunity to future generations, we've got to change course. And Mitt Romney has the experience, he's got the record, and he has the plans, the policies to be able to do that. And that will be, at the end, I think, the fundamental issue. Other issues will come and go, but over the next few months, that's going to be the question that people are going to have to ask. Who is better at getting this economy back on track? We've tried President Obama's policies. They haven't worked. By his own standards, they have not worked. Now it's time to try something else, and to try something that has the potential to work because it's time-tested, because it's based on the principles that have made America the strongest economy in the face of the earth and developed the strongest middle class in the face of the earth. And I think these are the fundamental issues that voters in New Hampshire and Ohio are going to be looking at over the next few months.
Senator,
Thank you, everyone. That's all the time we have.
September of 2008, George W. Bush left office as one of the most unpopular presidents in history. Is your connection or your service under George W. Bush a political liability, do you think, going forward?
I don't know. I served there in the Office of Management and Budget and as U.S. Trade Representative at a time when we had a strong economy, at a time when we had deficits that we would die for today. They were about 1/6 of the size of today's deficit, maybe 1/7. Deficit was about $161 billion in fiscal year 2007. I was able to propose a balanced budget, not over 10 years, but over 5 years. And I was able to do that because President Bush was able to make some tough decisions, was willing to make some tough decisions, but also because we had economic growth, unemployment 4 or 5%, and we had the possibility there of actually getting America back on track. So I'm proud of that record. I'm proud of the fact that while I was there, we put all earmarks online. I'm proud of the fact that we were able to work with Congress to come up with better spending bills. The President started to veto appropriations bills when I was there at my recommendation, which helped on the spending side. And again, to be able to propose a balanced budget over 5 years is something that I would love to see today. So there is an alternative to the way we're headed right now. We've all seen it, and frankly, it's the American economy and the American dream that really started in the 1980s. From that period until now, we've seen pretty sustained growth. Now and again, you have a recession, but then the economy comes back. We're not seeing that this time. When you compare where we are today to the recession in 1981, that was an equally deep recession. In fact, unemployment was higher in 81 than it was in this most recent recession. And at this point, about 49, 50 months after the recession, we had gained back over 7 million jobs. In this recession, unfortunately, this recovery, the weakest recovery since the Great Depression, we're still down 4.9 million jobs. So instead of gaining 6 or 7 million jobs, we're down almost 5 million jobs. And again, these jobs reports we just saw are additional evidence of the fact that this is not working. We're not getting back on our feet. Remember the jobless recovery after the 2001 recession. At this point, after the 2001 recession, we had gained back hundreds of thousands of jobs, over 400,000 jobs, net new jobs. Again, as compared to today, where we're still down almost 6 million jobs from where we were. We talked about the fact that the indicators on manufacturing, consumer confidence, and jobs are all going the wrong way. And it's time to change directions. And again, the good news is we've got a candidate who understands how the economy works, understands the role Washington needs to play, and has specific plans and ideas that he will implement on day one to begin to turn things around. And so I'm excited to be working for him and help him. And I'm hopeful that here in New Hampshire and in Ohio, which is probably a handful of states that are going to make the difference, that folks will take a long and hard look at the very distinct contrast between these two candidates. And look at the facts. Don't just look at the ads. And if they do so, I think it's going to work out well for the American people and well for Mitt Romney.
Thank you. Thank you.
Did you meet with 41? Bush 41?
No, I'm going to have lunch with him tomorrow. That's been public. I didn't get it out there, but one of you guys got it out there. Yeah.